Yes, that's a warm welcome today to Dikai. He's a professor of computer science and engineering at HKUST. He's an expert in artificial intelligence. Been really enjoying his sessions that he does on Clubhouse, and attended many of his talks at top conferences around the world, and also enjoy regular discussions with him. So please put your hands together and welcome Dikai. Thank you. So I suppose we'll begin if Dikai could maybe give an introduction as to his background, how he got started, what his inspiration is, and yeah, please Dikai.
Yeah, happy to do that. Thank you. Thank you for having me here. I have been someone wearing multiple hats, I guess, for many, many years. On the one hand, I'm a hardcore AI professor. Been doing AI research for over 35 years. I'm a professor at the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology, and was recruited to help, as one of several hundred who were recruited to help found the university here, which is the most American research university by far of anything in the region. I was recruited straight from Berkeley, where I did my PhD in AI, specifically in one of the earliest theses to argue for machine learning approaches and probabilistic statistical approaches instead of trying to encode all of the world's knowledge by hand using logic, which I spent 6-7 years in heated arguments with my advisor that I said that will never work. It's got to be probabilistic and statistical, and it's got to be able to learn by itself. Turns out that we were right, won that battle, although it took many years because the establishment in AI and academia hated us back then. We were considered radicals, today it's flipped to the opposite end. Today, everybody thinks AI is only machine learning or deep learning, and they've forgotten a lot of the stuff that we knew about higher order reasoning. That's why, when we look at the commercial AI systems, they keep on doing things that a 3-year-old would not make mistakes on. So we continue to do that at the university. When I came to Hong Kong 30 years ago, the first thing I did was to think, what should I apply this brave new world of machine learning, of natural language understanding to? And I realized, looking at Hong Kong's environment, for those of you who know it, it's a bilingual or a trilingual society now. You can count Mandarin and Cantonese as different languages. To me, it was very obvious that there were cultural divides and economic divides, class divides that were heavily reinforced by the linguistic barriers. And I thought, okay, that's what I'm going to tackle. And so I ended up pioneering things like Google Translate and Microsoft Translate or Baidu Translate or what have you. Made the first machines that would learn by themselves how to translate between Chinese and English, or in fact, between any pair of languages other than English and French, which IBM Watson was attempting to do at that time, and which I thought was completely cheating because they're the same language pronounced differently, more or less. So it's really easy to translate between English and French because so much of the vocabulary is the same. And for any word in French, there's 99% chance that there's a corresponding word in English and vice versa. Since so much of the vocabulary was borrowed during the Norman invasion in English anyway. This is clearly not true for Chinese and English, where even humans have a huge amount of difficulty translating very simple things in Chinese into English and vice versa. They're just, not only are there words in one that don't exist in the other, and we're talking about 2-year-old and 3-year-old language here. We're not talking about esoteric stuff. But ideas are framed quite differently. And so that's been fascinating to me. I'll give you an example of that, just because it's kind of helpful in pinning down some of this stuff. So I challenge my undergraduate classes in AI and natural language processing machine learning. Think about, the campaign slogan, like 10, 12 years ago, when Obama campaign was running. If you remember that campaign slogan, it was "Yes, we can." Right, and you had tens of thousands of people chanting that. Right, and I challenged them. Okay, how would you translate that into a Chinese, you know, campaign slogan? And so for any of you who happen to speak Chinese, some version of Chinese, you will sit there kind of going, which is what my undergrad students do, because number one, there's no word for yes in Chinese. I mean, there are words for true or correct, but like if somebody says, "Have you had lunch yet?" You don't say true, you don't say correct, right? There's no word for yes. In Chinese, you have to say basically you have to say "have eaten," um, and uh, uh, and then you could literally translate "we." You could literally translate "can." Uh, but if you did that into Chinese, which would be roughly, 我们可以, right? Then what you would end up with is something like akin to if somebody walked up to you and said, "We are able to," right? And you're going to be sitting there going, "What? You're able to what? What are you talking about?" Um, and so, like, we're talking about three of the simplest, shortest words in the English language. Yes, we and can, that 3-year-olds, learn first as they're learning English, and yet you can't even translate that short sentence effectively. Because why? Because different languages and different cultures frame things completely different. They frame ideas completely differently, right? And it goes both ways. Like, so in Chinese, one of the first words that kids learn is "guai," right? Which is impossible to translate right into English, right? People typically say obedient or well-behaved or good. They just kind of like good, whatever, right? What does good mean? And the reason it's hard to translate is because it wraps up all the cultural values of what is considered to be, virtuous human behavior according to that culture, right? And so it goes deep to Confucian values and Buddhist values and Taoist values and all that kind of stuff, all wrapped up, and there are plenty of words in Chinese that wrap that up, right? So guai is what you say to little kids, but like if you're talking philosophically or spiritually, right? Duh, which is the middle character of Dao De Ching, for in the classic Taoist work. Also, it's talking about virtue, right? But virtue in what sense? Well, it's all of that, right? It's all the cultural baggage in one word. And so you just can't translate it easily. And by the way, side note, the interesting thing here, I know I'm going off on a tangent. This is what happens when you let me free flow. But like you have, it's not just the difference between Chinese and Western languages, because if you, again, hop across the English Channel from England to France, it turns out that there is a French word that is actually a much better translation of this word guai, which is sage, right? Sage, which is where we in English get the word sage, but there's been a semantic meaning shift. In French, you can say that a child is sage, and it captures a lot of what guai kind of is in Chinese much more closely, because the French ideal of behavior is much more kind of calm and zen-like compared to a rather rambunctious, mischievous ideal of English kids, right? So all this stuff, it ties language and culture very much together. And I was fascinated from a standpoint of, not only scientifically, like what is it that makes humans human? What is it about us and our brains that differentiates us from all the other species? But also, what is the what is the social impact of this? How can I use this to help different cultures to relate to each other better, which has been basically, you will see, the root of everything that I do in life. Whether it's the tech or the music or the ethics and activism stuff that I work on, it's all about getting cultures to understand each other better. But then, so there's the science and there's the social engineering, and of course there's the the social impact, but of course there's also the engineering side of this, which is to build a large-scale machine learning system like that is just fascinating. There's so much that we can do practically with these technologies. I want to make sure that because my screen is frozen, I want to make sure that my signal is still coming through. Is my audio
Yeah.
still coming through?
Yeah, going through super well, and super interesting what you've shared before. Super curious, like you mentioned about the language of communication. How do you feel about the language of value, like some of this digital asset tokenization? You know, like the idea of Bitcoin as being this global medium of exchange, or the idea of lots of different tokens representing communities or projects or businesses. Like, how do you feel that sort of is emerging, or what's the future of that?
Yeah, I think it's kind of complex, to be honest. I do, some of you know that I do weekly deep dives on AI ethics on Clubhouse that have been sometimes somewhat legendary. I mean, we have 55-hour sessions is our record. And, I have MC Hammer helping me to hold these things down he did 35 of those 55 hours. And it's because we really try to unpack complex questions like that. We did, for example, the second of our sessions on intellectual property this past week. The metaphor of intellectual outputs as physical property, and whether that metaphor has reached its limits in the era of AI, where AI is increasingly creating a lot of the intellectual outputs. I think that a lot of the tokenization stuff interacts with that as well. And so a lot of the issues that we discussed, which were really complex, we ran like probably now a total of probably 14 hours on that discussion between the two sessions of that. And the challenge there is whether introducing artificial scarcity is the optimal path for unleashing as much intellectual creativity as possible. So we were doing really real thought experiments this past week. So this was the second of two sessions. The first session, we actually had major Hollywood lawyers, Ken Hertz, and people like MC Hammer and Poe and Deadmau5 and BT and other legendary producers, from Beyonce and so forth. And it was a very traditional mindset in as far as ownership of ideas. The second part, we were, okay, can we unshackle ourselves from that and just do thought experiments and see what happens if is there something that we can use to toss out the metaphor of property, right? Because, ideas are not actually fundamentally property, right? That's a metaphor that we use to kind of shoehorn it into the market-based system that we've inherited from an era where it was mostly about trade of physical goods, where you actually could physically be holding them. But ideas are a little bit more like, atmosphere, right? Like we don't talk about who owns the air. And so we were trying to unshackle ourselves completely from that, like, I don't know, take a pill and see where it can go, right? And one of the interesting concepts that came up was whether we could look at things instead of through the lens of ownership, through the metaphor of ownership, but instead through the lens of utilization. And so here's the key concept, right? Is that, well, a lot of creators, myself included, whether it's my music work or the research work or the ethics speaking, stuff like that, it's we don't get compensated for it. I mean, we might make, a few 10 to 100 times more instantly, right? And so as creators, we actually don't get compensated, I think, for the value necessarily of what we do in the current system. So that's one issue that people have been trying to tackle with tokenization, with especially with NFTs these days. But it's doing so by accepting the existing notion of property and ownership, and then grafting artificial scarcity onto that. well, and the questions we were asking, well, was, well, what if we tossed that out, let's say, and instead we actually used AI to track if you've created a new song, let's say, or even an AI has created a new song, or an AI working in collaboration with a human has created a new song. We could use AIs to track what were the raw inputs that went into your creation, right? Did you sample something? Did you borrow a melody or a riff or a very specific groove? And so you could actually create sort of a provenance chain that is assigning credit backwards in time, right? Because the folks that created the idea you drew from, they themselves drew from someone else or a whole bunch of other people, right? So that provenance train, if we could use that to assign the proportion of credit and then reward creators whose works are used in creating the new work. That would, on the one hand, be very similar to the way artificial neural nets work, deep learning works. It's how backprop networks work. Okay, and on the other hand, it would incentivize creators to actually release stuff, right? It would be like open source movement, but with compensation. So now instead of trying to create artificial scarcity and hold on to my output and say, this is, this is mine, you can't use it, you can't have it, you can't even see it. The incentives have now been turned around and it's like, here, take it, look, use it, right? Because the more you guys use it, the more I get compensated. And so a couple of things about that to tie it to this discussion. So on the one hand, this will require technological advance, but it is not pie in the sky, right? It's already happening to some extent. YouTube algorithms, Spotify, they're already using AIs to track that kind of thing. And it can be done for literary works as well. We use that at the university to detect plagiarism in the students. We do it all the time, right? So it is entirely foreseeable that this gets better and better in the coming years. And we index everything that is online, right? And again, that's not, it's very large, but it's not unthinkable because Google is already indexing everything online. And they're already attempting to catalog the indexing semantically, right? It just means that we're incrementally deepening the semantic understanding of that on cataloging of everything which is online. So, it's sort of like trying to tackle the scaling problem that AI and the internet is creating by using AI and the internet, which is probably the only thing that has the scale to deal with the problem in the first place, right? And so that's one thing. And then the other thing I would tie that to here is, well, tokenization could well be a very good way of creating these anchor points for AIs to be able to track provenance through, both in some ways. We can use blockchain, et cetera, to track provenance in a forward direction. So, when you use something which is on the blockchain and you create something else, that's documented that you've used it. But then also in terms of provenance detection, like AIs can use that to help with backtracing. You may have forgotten to say, I was strongly influenced by that. I borrowed the riff from there or something, but the AI can detect it, right? So I do think that sort of a lot of these tokenization and blockchain ideas can work hand in hand with the utilization-based approach. And basically what I'm looking at is how can we create an abundance mindset instead of an artificial scarcity mindset.
Amazing. Totally agree with you then. It's super, super exciting. How do you look at the ethical standpoint or the moral side of artificial intelligence? Or let's say you've got the existence of decentralized autonomous organizations. How do you hold a piece of code accountable for particular decisions? Or do you feel that machines or code can even have a moral conscience? Can you program that sort of ethics in?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's a subfield within AI ethics, which is moral cognition. And it is, you know, a kind of cognition like anything else. There are, so mental processing, broadly speaking, we have what are called automatic mental processes, or, you know, they're preconscious or subconscious. So you're not aware of them. And that's like probably 99% of your mental processing. Um, because you're not sitting there thinking, oh, sitting, that was a verb, not, that was a negation, and you, that was the subject of the verb, right? You're not doing any of this consciously, right? Most of our processing is being done just by very fast processing. It's very heuristic, it's very probabilistic, it's associative. We handle all this ambiguity that's constantly in every sentence completely unconsciously, right? We don't even, most of the time, we don't even notice that there's some ambiguity in every single word. It's all pattern recognition. And we just come to the most plausible interpretation, even though there are other interpretations that are a little bit less probable. And it's mostly Pavlovian conditioning. So it's that kind of learning is mostly like my pet dog, right? It's our heuristics. We sort of learn by repetition, and if we make a mistake, there's a slight negative reinforcement, and over time our brains adapt. And you don't have to think about it. When you learned English or whatever your native language is, nobody in your parents was constantly telling you what the grammar was, what the syntax was, right? Your brains just sort it out through repetition. The other kind of mental processing is more conscious, controlled reasoning. And the difference between this is what Danny Kahneman, in his book, Thinking Fast and Slow, calls System 1 versus System 2. And very little of our mental processing is actually System 2, is actually above the level of conscious awareness. And so when we talk about ethics and morality, I think one of the things that's kind of important to recognize is, again, the way we humans deal with that stuff is also on these two levels. So on the one hand, a lot of the way people react to these kinds of ethical issues is really System 1. It's really just gut reaction. How do you feel about it? Oh, that feels wrong. Very little of it is actually, you know, a small proportion of that is actually conscious reasoning about the ethics. Because it turns out if you start reasoning about the ethics, you very rapidly realize, wait a minute, there's contradictions between these two moral principles that I hold. Because the real world is messy. It's full of those contradictions, right? As Isaac Asimov's classic I, Robot stories were, you know, dozens and dozens of classic stories, each one based on when one of his only 3 laws of robotics, he had only 3 moral laws for robots, right? And every story was when 2 of those laws were in contradiction to each other. Right. So you imagine if you have so many contradictions between only 3 laws or 3 rules, imagine if we try to create, you know, hundreds of ethics rules, which people have been trying to do for AI. It's just constantly going to be in a state of contradiction. And this is a message that I've been trying to explain. I'm not trying to say we should toss out rules, but you have to recognize the limits of rule-based approaches. Just like in the development of AI, when during my student days, everybody was trying to solve AI by writing down every single logical rule about the way the world operates, that was destined to fail because the world is not rule-based. And that's why they could never write more than a few hundred rules without their rule base collapsing internally from contradictions. And we have that same lesson that we need to urgently learn when it comes to, you know, AI ethics in society, which is, in the end, you have to do optimization. You have to look at that the real world is shades of gray. There's trade-offs, and you have to make the best of it. The ethical thing to do is to think as hard as you can about the consequences, especially the unintended consequences of what we're deciding, and then choose the decisions that have the most ethical outcomes, right? And so it's optimization. And to do so in a way where individuals retain as much what we call virtue ethics as possible, right? So there's three strands of ethics traditionally. Um, there's rule-based ethics, which is what people casually on the street think you mean when you say ethics, right? It's like, what are the rules? But that's actually a very modern, recent notion of what ethics is. Rule-based ethics, or what the philosophers technically call deontological ethics, that alone cannot solve the problem because the rules keep falling behind. Today's rules are falling behind AI and technology rapidly. They don't work anymore. What worked 100 years ago doesn't work today anymore, thanks to social media, AI recommendation engines, AI warfare, and many other things. Consequentialist ethics, which is what I was talking about, anticipating the consequences, especially the unintended ones. And finally, virtue ethics, which goes back to Aristotle and Confucius and the Buddha and so forth. Is like, at the end of the day, even if you can't anticipate all the consequences, even if the rules are constantly in contradiction and lagging the reality of the world, for it all to hang together, we need a society where everybody individually is focusing on trying to do the right thing locally. And that's called virtue ethics. So again, I apologize. You asked me to free flow, so this is what happens. I'll come back and let you redirect.
Really cool. And I guess you mentioned this idea of this post-scarcity economy, where there's much more free-flowing access to ideas and people, IP being not withheld by a small minority of people. What sort of timeline can you imagine this happening? And do you think it's possible that tokens can be used for remuneration, so that everyone gets a fair share of um, of compensation, and we move to a society where it's much more abundance, and people are more comfortable to create music or do things that they enjoy?
I think if it's done right, that is a hope. So this is one of those things where I think we're on the cusp, and it could go in a good way, and it could go in a bad way. It could go in a very good way, and it could go in a very bad way. So one of the things, of course, when we talk about utilization, when we talk about provenance and stuff like that, we're talking about transparency, right? I think so. One of those messy real world contradictions that people are constantly sweeping under the rug, they don't want to look at it because it's uncomfortable, is that there is this tension between transparency and privacy, right? And you often hear the same person, in at one moment they're like rallying for privacy rights, in a fairly extreme way, and then the next day you hear them rallying for transparency. In an extreme way. And the thing is that these things are often logically just like at odds, right? You can have one or the other. The fact that our personal data is held in the West by the Facebooks and the Amazons and the Googles and the Apples and the Microsofts is like, well, they're holding it in a very non-transparent way to us, right? And it's in the hands of a few privileged companies. And then if you contrast that against, other models where that kind of information is held by the government, it's like people often in the West, they have a knee-jerk system one, level reaction against that because, Nazis or whatever. But then they don't really necessarily ask, well, but in principle, all that data at Facebook and Google and Amazon, like that, a lot of people have been crying out needs regulation and all that. Would you rather have all your personal data in the hands of greedy for-profit corporations, that are not accountable to you, or would you rather have all that data in heavily regulated government conditions that at least government is supposed to in principle be accountable to us, the people, and not just for profit, right? And which of these two scenarios reflects privacy, and which of these two scenarios reflects transparency? And it rapidly gets a lot more complicated than the rhetoric tends to show. So I think that in terms of the tokenization, it's very much kind of the same thing. there are ways of using it that I think give credit to creators that are all about transparency and abundance. There are other ways that are, hiding a lot of trafficking and money laundering and other things. So the question is, how do we do it? I think it's hard to give a simple answer to. Is it the right way to go? Because it depends on how we use that technology.
Amazing. A really cool question
Does that
here
make
from.
sense?
Sorry, I interrupted.
No, I was just asking if what I said made sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Super fascinating. A nice question here from Yip. How do conscious systems make decisions, and what is important when designing these kind of systems?
What was the question? I'm sorry.
Speaking of ambiguity, how do conscious systems deal with ambiguity? How do they make decisions, and what is important when designing these kinds of systems? Question from Yip.
So the way most ambiguity is dealt with is the same as in human brains, which is it's dealt with unconsciously because it's too slow otherwise. The reason evolution left us with brains that resolve all these ambiguities unconsciously is because they're just lightning fast. And if you have to reason through it all, you'll be here until the next century just processing this one conversation we're having. So the question is, at what points do you want to have the conscious parts kick in, right? Because basically what happens is unlike our pet dogs over here, which are pretty much all operating on system one, which is all about adaptive, sort of Pavlovian conditioning, we developed our language abilities, right? The reason I chose to work on natural language as an application of AI and machine learning is because that is fundamentally what differentiates us from all the other animal species. We don't do hardly anything else better, right? We don't run faster. We don't swim better. We have almost lost any ability to climb trees. We don't fly. We don't smell better. We don't see sharper. We don't smell. It's like we're pathetic as a species, except for our ability with language, which is closely related to our music abilities. Basically, our ancestors were singing before they were talking, and then we sort of scaffolded a lot of our language abilities on that. And then they co-evolved so that we used our linguistic abilities later to make more sophisticated music. And so we've kind of been co-evolving language and music, which are the things that we do better than my pet dog. And so when we do system two, sort of conscious reasoning, we're using that linguistic ability. We're like almost like just talking to ourselves. Actually, a lot of time we literally are talking to ourselves in our head when we think consciously. And we're making use of our language to try to explain what our unconscious is driving us to do, right? You have an intuition, you have it, you feel, oh yeah, I should do this. But then your conscious brain kicks in and says, why do I feel like doing that? Is that the right thing to do, right? And you start second guessing your intuition. And you start trying to explain what you're doing. And a lot of time, this is why a lot of times when you try to explain what you're doing, you're actually not so much explaining the logic of your choice as you're rationalizing what your unconscious system one made you feel like doing, right? It's like, why did you buy that Ferrari? Oh, well, I needed a smaller car. No, you felt like buying the Ferrari. Now your conscious brain is trying to find a way to explain that. But it isn't necessarily what your unconscious actually did to arrive at that feeling about what it wanted to do. And so, what was I talking about? why did there was a reason I was bringing this up.
Ambiguity in designing.
I knew why I was bringing this up. That was the ambiguity. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah. So the thing is, like, sometimes with the ambiguity, you want your conscious brain to kick in. right? And be mindful of what your unconscious did. So like if you're listening to a comedian, right? A lot of comedy is based on kind of leading your automatic processing one way and then surprise, that's not the way that it was going, right? And so that interaction between your conscious and your unconscious, um, excuse me, I need a drink, is a lot of how you have to optimize dealing with ambiguity. You can't have your conscious address every piece of ambiguity because almost every single word is ambiguous. But you have to choose those key points where you want to become mindful of what's going on. There's, by the way, if you're, sorry, let me take a drink.
A really cool question here from Myron in the chat. Sorry.
If you're interested in that particular topic, there's a talk I gave TEDx Oakland, I think the year before last, that was about artificial mindfulness, and not in the woo-woo sense, but like in the sense of modeling when you're mindful of what you're doing versus when it's just your unconscious and you're just following whatever you feel like doing without really thinking about it, kind of like my pet dog over here does.
Amazing. A question from Myron in the chat. How can you keep government accountable? Like, is there any way artificial intelligence or software technology can create the evolution of government?
Yeah. No, that's a really good question. I do think I think that's a really important question. I don't know that we can answer it, but the very top level is I feel like in a lot of these discussions, people, especially Americans, come into it from a perspective that you can never trust government, and so everything has to be set up in opposition to government. And then I think Europeans often are somewhere in the middle there. Europeans are much more socialistic, on average, that there's a higher level of, well, as long as we manage our government well, we can trust it. And, so we sort of, and, uh, and, and then obviously as you move toward China, it's very much like, oh, everything's about trusting the government, right? And so there's kind of that spectrum. And the key question there is, well, how do you set up a government so that it is trustworthy? And again, transparency and having things on record is, I think, a big part of that. Having, even what I was talking about earlier about, potentially using AIs to be able to backtrace where things came from, that could be you can think of that as it's a kind of auditing, right? So that could also come into the picture in terms of helping. In general, just integration of data. So a lot of untrustworthy stuff tends to come when this party has this information and that party has walled off that little piece of information and so forth, right? And so nobody can tell where things are, and it's very easy to hide things. And so again, I think tokenization there are lots of ways that can be used to help increase the reliability and the transparency and the comprehensiveness of being more sure that you see more of what's going on in whether it's in government or in companies. Yeah, but it's a really long discussion. Whose question was that? That was Maria. No, Myra.
From
question.
Myra.
Yeah, I mean, that deserves a day-long conversation.
And love to hear like what your
and government are embedded companies. Yeah.
Very cool. I'd love to hear you in terms of like your passion or dream for the future. Like what are you looking forward to, optimistic about in society progressing?
You know, so I think empiricism is really important. Yes, I'm a scientist, and yes, I make predictive models, and yes, I build complex theories. But at the end of the day, one of the things that in AI, um, our little revolt 30 years ago to overturn the establishment was saying you have all these logic-based theories, but you never test your theories. You build these little tiny scale AIs, these expert systems and stuff like that, and then you claim my idea is better than yours, but you never run statistically significant experiments to prove your claims. Um, and I kind of feel that way in general, right? There's a lot of theory, there's a lot of ideology. At the end of the day, we have to look at how well systems operate, because all of these societies and everything else we're talking about, and machine learning as well, they're all complex dynamic systems. And I grew up as the son of a theoretical physicist, so I sort of grew up with the notion of complex dynamic systems, where you can build theoretical models of it, but you have to be intellectually honest, hold your feet to the fire, and at the end of the day, test well. Do the predictions of your theory actually hold in practice? So you have to look at, well, which governance systems and empirically are producing which results, which governmental systems, ignoring the ideology and the theory, are producing things that are going off of the rails in one way or another. I'm American, so I feel perfectly entitled and, in fact, responsible to acknowledge that our system has been going off the rails in a number of ways. But just acknowledge that, and then look at, well, okay, so what does work, both in the U.S. and in all the other countries, what is working and what isn't working, and what are the techniques that could be used to compensate, for that. There are many things that really disturb me about how I feel we are sticking our heads in the sand and continue to do sort of rah cheerleading ourselves stuff. Again, I'm speaking as an American here, and falling behind actually in a lot of ways when you look at empirical results. So looking forward, I think a lot of what we need to do has to do with being able to put our identitarianism with respect to being American, or what have you, a little bit, kind of beside ourselves, and to like look honestly, uh, with open minds at what is working, that is perhaps not within the system exactly the way that we grew up with it, and what's broken in our own system. And that's again part of why I think it's so important to me personally, that everything I do, I mentioned earlier, is about getting cultures to relate to each other more in a more open way, and to just put aside my personal prejudices and really try to understand holistically, well, how is that culture working? How is that society working? And suspend judgment until then. It's what in ethics and in linguistics, it's the difference between a descriptive approach and a prescriptive approach. Right? One of the lessons that we learned in natural language processing, which is also called computational linguistics, is that if you take a prescriptive linguistics approach, which is what your grammar school teacher did, right? They tell you, no, you can't dangle prepositions at the ends of your sentences. That's wrong, right? That's being prescriptive, right? But if you're being a scientist, if you're being doing, proper descriptive linguistics, you don't start by prescribing what's right and wrong. Instead, you start by describing how are cultures actually using language. Right? And it turns out in English, we're constantly putting prepositions at the ends of our sentences, and it works just great. And everybody understands each other, and it flows more smoothly, right? And so it's the same thing when it comes to ethics, society, and governance. Is, I think, just, it's not as sexy. It doesn't necessarily make us feel as good to rush to prescribe and judge. But if we do that hard sweat work of just describing in detail with suspension of judgment and prescriptiveness, um, just describe how cultures are working, because we have 7,000 languages in the world still. That means 7,000 cultures, and they all survive the test of time. They're all working somehow, and they're working differently. And I think that's one of the things that is good for us to explore. And it's something that diversity is actually useful for exploring. So yeah, and another one of the things that I look at a lot in terms of like diversity comes up a lot in ethics. And I always do find it a little bit striking that again, you have a lot of times the same people who are champions and advocates for diversity, at the same time insisting on imposing their moral stance on the entire world without bothering to necessarily understand, oh, here's one of the 7,000 cultures, and here's how their moral system works, which would be a true diversity approach.
Amazing. Final question maybe here. Thank you so much for sharing your insights. The guy's been super enlightening and inspiring. Question from Bianca. How can this AI progression help people be happier, more free and fulfilled with their lives?
Sorry, which question is it? How can?
Question from Bianca. The
I'm
final
looking
part
for
is, how can this AI progression help people be happier, more free and fulfilled with their lives? Like how can it enrich people and
Yeah. So I honestly think that it's being able to see things from different perspectives is both our strength as humans and our weakness as humans. We're much more capable than my pet dog or other species at being able to see things from a different perspective, right? We use our language ability to frame complex or abstract things in the world and to look at causality, cause and effect, and many other things. That's a strength, but at the same time, we have hundreds of unconscious cognitive biases that arise from the exaggerated way that our system one unconscious mental processes work. They're fast, but they're prone to exaggeration. They're prone to mistakes. And so I think, it's really, really important for AIs to help us overcome that in the same way that AIs help overcome my weaknesses in spatial orientation. And so like I've handed that over to Google Maps and I'm lost without it. I have no idea where I am. And whether it's memorizing phone numbers or anything else like that, right? AIs can also be kind of that for our weaknesses in being able to see things from other perspectives than the ones that we've already locked ourselves into. And that's powerful because seeing things from as many different angles as possible is what gives us new levels of understanding, gives us new insights. So for me, that is something that is important to help people to be happier and less in conflict from not understanding where other people are coming from. It's one of the major strands that I'm working on research-wise is the artificial empathy, being able to see things from somebody else's headspace, like real empathy, not just sympathy, not just, oh, I'm happy for you or I'm sad for you, but like really being able to look at things through someone else's eyes. I think that will make people happier if they have that, because then people will realize more what the humanity that we all share really is. So I'm optimistic about that, and also the stuff we talked about before, unleashing creativity more. So and by the way, I do want to so I know there's too many topics, so I do want to say happy if you reach out and connect to me. Actually, why don't I put into my